Margaret Turner had never anticipated that her life could pivot so quietly on what seemed like an ordinary evening. Life, she had learned over the years, had a way of changing subtly, creeping in through seemingly insignificant moments that only revealed their weight in hindsight. That night, her daughter Emily was celebrating her birthday, and the household was filled with warmth, the laughter of friends, the aroma of home-cooked food, and a comfort that made Margaret feel grateful for the rhythm of her simple life in a peaceful Seattle suburb. Emily had married Daniel Hayes a few years earlier, a man regarded by everyone as steady, considerate, and gentle, the kind of person whose presence could quiet even the most chaotic of rooms. Margaret liked him and respected him. She had always assumed that beneath his calm exterior, Daniel stored his emotions meticulously, never allowing them to spill carelessly into the world. Yet, as the evening unfolded, something intangible began to shift in a way Margaret could neither predict nor articulate. After the candles were extinguished and the remnants of birthday cake were cleared away, Emily excused herself to take a work call outside. That left Margaret and Daniel alone in the kitchen, the soft hum of the dishwasher filling the air and the lingering scent of warm vanilla hovering around them. It was supposed to be a mundane moment, a mother-in-law and son-in-law tidying up together, but the atmosphere felt oddly charged, as though time itself had paused to observe them. Daniel handed Margaret a dish towel, and their hands brushed ever so slightly. The contact was brief and inconsequential, yet his reaction made her pause. He stopped mid-motion, and when their eyes met, his gaze lingered longer than it had any reason to. It wasn't a look of flirtation, nor was it intrusive. There was no audacity, no forcefulness. Instead, it carried a quiet curiosity, a gentle confusion, as if he had glimpsed something in her he hadn't expected and didn't yet know how to process. Margaret felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest, not excitement, not desire, but a sharp awareness of an unexpected shift in the ordinary. She smiled faintly, stepped back, and moved as though nothing had passed between them. But the memory of that fleeting moment clung stubbornly, like a whisper she couldn't shake. Daniel's attention returned to the dish in his hands, and for a moment, his usually composed face bore a softness Margaret had never seen, vulnerability that made her wonder about the quiet storms he may harbor beneath his serene exterior. She continued putting away the dishes, her hands moving mechanically while her mind wrestled with that strange instant, trying to assign it some logical place in the narrative of who Daniel was. He had always been a man who respected boundaries, who concealed his emotions carefully, and yet in that glance, she had glimpsed curiosity, uncertainty, a loneliness that seemed both delicate and profound. Emily returned shortly thereafter, laughing as she tucked her phone into her bag and wrapping her arms around Daniel. He smiled, but the expression felt quick and practiced, almost fragile. Margaret noticed, but she kept silent, knowing well that people often mask the things they could not articulate. They finished tidying the kitchen, exchanged goodnights, and retired to their separate rooms. Yet, even as Margaret lay in her bed, the image of Daniel's eyes lingered. She stared at the dim ceiling above, replaying the moment over and over. It wasn't about flirtation, and she wasn't confused in any romantic sense. It was simply a disquieting awareness that she had seen a flicker of something unspoken, something human, raw, and unshielded. She reminded herself of her age 53, a mother, a soon-to-be grandmother, someone who had learned the distinction between genuine peril and mere human vulnerability. Yet, that night, the memory nested deep in her mind, refusing to release its grip. Margaret prided herself on her ability to read people, honed over decades of parenting and living alone enough to understand the subtleties of human expression. Daniel's fleeting softness had slipped past her defenses, something heavier and lonelier than admiration or desire. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of another person seeing him in a way he wasn't accustomed to being seen. Turning onto her side. She drew the blanket closer, her breath steadying against the strange ache in her chest. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't danger. It was simply the truth of human emotion laid bare, a quiet, undeniable moment where someone's inner sorrow had become visible, even if only for a heartbeat. When morning came, life resumed its ordinary pace. Margaret brewed her coffee, tended to her plants, and told herself it was likely a trick of fatigue or perhaps the weight of Daniel's long work week. But try as she might to dismiss it, the memory remained, a subtle shift in his gaze that would not be ignored. In the days following that evening, Margaret noticed subtle but unmistakable changes. Daniel, usually a steady presence, now carried a weariness that seemed to settle in his posture and the fleeting shadows behind his eyes. His smiles became tentative, fleeting, often ending before they reached his gaze. Emily, preoccupied with her career, brushed these signs off as stress, but Margaret recognized them for what they were: a deeper unrest, a quiet fracture in a man who had once been uncheckable. One evening, after a week of rain that painted the skies a muted gray, Margaret stepped onto the backyard porch with a mug of tea and found Daniel sitting alone on the steps. His expression, distant and fatigued, drew her concern before she could stop herself. He hadn't noticed her approach, and she watched him for a moment, weighing the choice to turn back against the pull of empathy. Finally, she moved closer and asked gently if he was all right. Daniel did not startle or mask his feelings. Instead, he exhaled, a soft, strained breath that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken confessions. He offered few words, only the admission that he was doing his best, and in that simplicity, Margaret sensed a vulnerability that words might never capture. She sat beside him, careful to maintain a respectful distance and simply express that she cared. Not as a mother-in-law, not as an observer, but as a fellow human being recognizing sorrow in another. For the first time in days, his expression softened, though uncertainty lingered in his gaze. When he whispered his thanks, it sounded genuine, raw, and long overdue. From that night on, Daniel did not return to his previous calm. His quietness remained, but it was a different quiet and emotional distance that seeped into interactions with Emily and others alike. Margaret watched silently, observing subtle signs: a tense shoulder when Emily spoke, hesitation answering simple questions, a pull into internal worlds invisible to those around him. Emily, absorbed in work and life, barely noticed, assuming he simply needed space. Margaret, however, understood. There was something deeper at work, a subtle unspooling that no one else had recognized. Weeks passed, each moment drawing Margaret's awareness to the changes. She observed him at family dinners, barely eating, barely speaking, smiles that didn't reach his eyes. She realized that Daniel's withdrawal was not about her. It was a sign of a quiet inner fracture, a vulnerability that had begun to surface. She sensed that sooner or later he might confide in her, not because it was right, but because he had no one else who noticed the silent, tender signs he could not voice. And while she could not know when or how this would happen, she felt the inevitability of it, the subtle pull of something unspoken that lingered in the air whenever Daniel entered a room. As the tension stretched on, Margaret became acutely aware of every nuance: the slouching shoulders, the averted glances, the small hesitations in ordinary conversation. Daniel's inner disturbance was becoming increasingly visible, and she feared for him silently, knowing she could not step fully into the marriage or solve the unnameable unrest within him. Yet she could not dismiss the signals that had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life. Then one stormy evening arrived. Rain pounded against the windows and wind rattled the trees. Emily was away for work, leaving Margaret and Daniel alone in the house once more. The quiet was oppressive, thick with unspoken tension. Daniel appeared at the back door, soaked through, his coat clinging to his frame, hair damp, his usual composure replaced by something raw and uncertain. Margaret instinctively handed him a towel, but he paused, taking in the familiar kitchen that suddenly seemed strange, almost foreign. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and trembling, carrying the weight of unshared burdens. Margaret Turner had never imagined that an ordinary evening could quietly tilt the balance of her life. Yet sometimes change didn't announce itself with fireworks or drama. It seeped in through small, almost invisible moments that only made sense in hindsight. It was her daughter Emily's birthday, and the evening had begun in familiar comfort, laughter spilling across the dining table, the scent of homemade food, the warmth of family filling their quiet Seattle home. Emily had married Daniel Hayes years earlier, a man everyone called steady and gentle, someone whose presence could calm the loudest room. Margaret had always liked him, respected him, even admired the quiet thoughtfulness he carried behind a reserved exterior. But that night, something subtle shifted. A small ripple in the fabric of their ordinary lives. After the candles were blown out and the dishes stacked, Emily stepped outside to take a call, leaving Margaret and Daniel alone in the kitchen. The hum of the dishwasher and the lingering smell of vanilla cake should have been enough to make the moment ordinary, yet the air felt unusually still, as if holding its breath. When Daniel handed her a dish towel, their hands brushed. A fleeting touch, insignificant on its own, but the way he paused, meeting her gaze longer than expected, unsettled her. It wasn't romantic, not even intense. It was quiet curiosity, a fleeting recognition of something he hadn't anticipated in her presence. Margaret felt a sudden tightness in her chest, a pang of unease rather than excitement. She forced a small smile, stepping back as if nothing had happened. But the echo of that brief look lingered. Daniel quickly diverted his attention to the plate he was trying, a hint of embarrassment passing across his usually composed face. But there was something different there, a softness she had never noticed, a vulnerability carefully tucked away. Margaret's hands moved automatically, putting away dishes while her mind replayed the moment. Daniel had never crossed boundaries. He hadn't played games or toyed with emotions. So why had his eyes betrayed such depth, such fragile curiosity? Before she could dwell on it further, Emily returned, phone tucked away, wrapping her arms around Daniel with ease. His smile met hers, polite and light, but Margaret noticed a subtle tension lurking beneath it. She said nothing, having learned long ago that some truths were best observed silently. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fleeting glance, the subtle shift in his demeanor. It wasn't about desire. It wasn't about misread signals. It was something heavier, human vulnerability. Daniel had let a fragment of himself show, a quiet ache he had been hiding. By morning, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Margaret tended her plants, sipped her coffee, and tried to convince herself that perhaps it was all a trick of fatigue or stress. Yet a stubborn question lingered. Something had changed in Daniel, something unspoken that would inevitably resurface. Over the following days, Margaret couldn't ignore the shift. Daniel moved with a subdued weight, spoke less, smiled only when necessary. Emily assumed it was work stress, leaving him to his quiet solitude. But Margaret noticed the deeper fissures, the slight slump in his shoulders, the hesitation in his eyes, the way he seemed almost lost in thought. One rainy evening, when Emily was away, Margaret found Daniel on the porch steps, staring into the darkened trees. The storm outside mirrored the tension she saw in him. She hesitated, unsure whether to intrude, but something compelled her to sit beside him. She didn't press or question. She simply offered quiet presence. "I'm doing my best," he finally admitted, voice low, strained. Margaret nodded, sensing the weight of his words, Not a confession of failure, but the raw honesty of a man grappling with his inner turmoil. She didn't offer advice, didn't try to fix him. Instead, she simply let him know she understood. That acknowledgement, simple yet profound, seemed to unburden him slightly. Their silence became a shared language, a human connection forged not in romance, but in recognition of each other's quiet struggles. Over the next week, the tension persisted. Margaret observed Daniel carefully, noting the subtle cracks that appeared in his calm facade. At family dinners, his laughter seemed muted, absent of warmth. Margaret realized that his withdrawal wasn't about her presence. It was an internal struggle, a fissure in the man she had known as composed and reliable. She wanted to help, yet knew her role was limited. Still, she carried the awareness of his pain, the unspoken burden he bore, and the brief moments when she had glimpsed the vulnerability beneath his steady exterior. One stormy night, Emily away again, Daniel returned soaked from the rain, his usual calm replaced by raw uncertainty. Margaret handed him a towel, watching silently as he lingered, taking in the kitchen with quiet detachment. Finally he spoke. "We're in trouble," the words falling like stones. Margaret stayed calm, offering no judgment, simply a listening presence. He admitted that he felt trapped in gentleness, that living with him sometimes felt like existing in a whisper. Her heart twisted at his confession, not because it changed her feelings toward him, but because it revealed a human struggle so intimate it could only be witnessed silently. She sat across from him, steady and calm, offering reassurance without solutions. "It's not your fault, Daniel," she said softly. "Being gentle isn't weakness. It's who you are." His eyes met hers again, raw and searching, carrying exhaustion, fear, and a strange relief at being understood. He exhaled slowly, letting the weight of unspoken frustration ease slightly. Margaret felt a deep empathy, recognizing the ache of caring for someone fully while feeling helpless in return. She let him sit with his emotions, witnessing his struggle without crossing boundaries. Hours passed in quiet companionship, the storm outside echoing the tension in the room. Eventually, he whispered his fear. "I don't know how to fix myself for her." Margaret's response was steady, deliberate, a quiet recognition. "You're enough. Who you are matters. Others may not see it, but that doesn't make you less." In that moment, the space between them shifted, a connection deepened not through romance, but through honest human recognition. Time seemed suspended as they shared a silence that spoke louder than words. When morning came, Daniel rose to leave, shoulders lighter, carrying the clarity of choice. Margaret offered a final word of guidance. "Go fight for your marriage and for yourself." His nod was firm, a commitment to responsibility over confusion. As he departed, Margaret remained by the window, watching him walk toward his car, rain-soaked pavement glinting in the sunlight. She felt a bittersweet mixture of relief, hope, and the subtle ache of human closeness. Life would continue in its familiar rhythm. Yet Margaret carried with her the memory of that stormy night, the kitchen and the fragile bond forged in quiet honesty. It wasn't about romance or temptation, it was about witnessing, acknowledging and sharing the weight of human emotion in a way that could never be erased. Margaret moved through her day with renewed awareness of patience, empathy, and the intricate reality of caring without overstepping. And in the quiet moments, she could still feel the echo of Daniel's searching, vulnerable gaze, a reminder of the quiet power of human connection.